Hello and welcome to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman in for Richard French. We start tonight with the Capitol Riot and Democrats continuing to push for answers about that terrible day. Today, House Democrats announced plans to create a commission to investigate it. Speaker Nancy Pelosi issuing this statement, quote, "It is imperative that we seek the truth of what happened on January 6th with an independent, bipartisan 9/11 type commission to examine and report upon the facts, causes, and security relating to the terrorist mob attack." Worth noting that House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy has not agreed to anything, at least not yet, but at least there are signs of progress. Meanwhile, House Republicans have appointed a replacement for Liz Cheney in their leadership ranks, as many of them continue to rewrite the history of the attack on the Capitol. The majority of House Republicans making it clear their identity is tied to former President Donald Trump, electing Trump-backed candidate Elise Stefanik, who promoted Trump's lies of widespread election fraud, to replace Liz Cheney as their new third-ranking official.
I also want to thank President Trump for his support. He is a critical part of our Republican team. In recent days, some Republicans have been doubling down in their efforts to cast doubt on the 2020 elections, and now even trying to minimize the savagery caught on camera during the deadly January 6th insurrection.
There was no insurrection, and to call it an insurrection, in my opinion, is a bold-faced lie.
I don't know on a normal day around here when people are threatening to hang the Vice President of the United States.
Multiple videos captured that day show rioters breaking into the Capitol, attacking officers, and calling for the heads of the Vice President.
Where are you, Nancy? We're looking for you.
And Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. D.C. Metro Police Officer Michael Musto, who was beaten with a flagpole and suffered a heart attack, telling CNN he and other officers were absolutely traumatized by the attempt to rewrite history.
You know, this isn't about, the political future of one party. This is about right and wrong.
This week, the Justice Department made another arrest in their federal case, Christopher Warnagiris. Prosecutors say he's seen here in the jacket and military backpack, now identified by prosecutors as the first active duty military officer to be charged in the deadly January 6th attack on the Capitol. Prosecutors say the 20-year Marine Corps veteran defied orders and violently pushed and resisted Capitol police officers as he entered the building during the insurrection. He's now one of roughly 440 accused rioters charged in the attack on the Capitol. Back to Liz Cheney, who of course was stripped of her leadership post, but she is not staying quiet and she isn't going anywhere.
I think that it's very important for us to be a party based on truth. I think it's important for us to understand the threat that the claims the former president is making. The threat is ongoing. I think we know that the kinds of language we've heard from him has caused violence in the past, and there's clearly an attempt to unravel the democracy, if you will, by focusing on challenging the legitimacy of the election. The issue is, are we going to be a party that sits by silently while the former president continues to perpetuate lies about the election? And it is the case that there are too many people in the leadership of the Republican Party today who've been willing not only to sit by silently, but to help enable that.
To help digest all of this, we turn to our first guest tonight. He just penned an opinion piece in the Washington Post with the headline, "Trump's Place in History? He is the Supreme American Demagogue." EliMerritt is an adjunct professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. Professor, we've spent the last couple of weeks trying to put the Cheney for Stefanik swap into perspective, both for the Republican Party and for the nation. What's your sense? How significant, how impactful is what House Republicans just did?
Well, I think that what's significant here is what Liz Cheney has done. Liz Cheney has stepped up in the most significant way an American leader, elected leader can, really as a profile in courage. I have recently done an analysis of JFK's book, Profile in Courage, and she really meets the criteria. She is stepping up for our constitutional democracy, and she is stepping up for truth. And this is the glue that holds our constitutional democracy together. And so that's what's on my radar and what I think we should be celebrating really now.
And we've certainly been trying to do that, but it does seem like she's been doing so in something of a vacuum in Republican circles. We've focused a lot on Republican elected officials, Trump, McCarthy, McConnell, people like that, conservative media as well, for giving the big lie and the Trumpist view of the party the oxygen that it has gotten recently. Do Republican voters play a role in this as well? Who do you hold responsible?
This is a complicated question. I'll again suggest that if I can borrow once again from John F. Kennedy, we have the profiling courage, which is a very rare politician in a political party. And then he describes the other dominant thing you have is the profile in conformity. So I think that's what we're seeing in the Republican Party. And I think a lot of us can stand outside of it and find it to be remarkable that there would not be hundreds or dozens of Liz Cheney characters. But history really demonstrates that a number of critical forces acting on those members of a political party, I'm referring to the political leaders now, are really overwhelming. And that is their fear of rejection and ostracism from their group, the party, their fear of loss of really love and support from their constituents, and then, of course, their fear of loss of re-election. I don't hold the voters responsible because we elect elected officials to be leaders. And the first and foremost part of being a leader is adhering to the truth.
Was reading through your recent LA Times op-ed. In it, you called Trump the ultimate American demagogue, and you said he's not going to go away. We've spent so much energy focused on Trump and a possible return to power, and something to fear, but there are a lot of others now following the Trump playbook who seem to be itching to be the next demagogue. They might be more competent at it than Trump was. What's the nightmare scenario for you? What keeps you up at night when considering the future of the Republican Party?
Well, I think the nightmare scenario to me is a step beyond what we saw over the past 4 years. Demagogues go into many levels of government, and it's been well known the most perilous has been if you get into the White House, into the Oval Office. And so the nightmare scenario to me is that we get another demagogue into the White House, whether, to be fair, whether Republican or Democrat. And the way I view what a demagogue does in the White House, and the most powerful post not only in the country and the world, is they take a sledgehammer to the critical pieces of the puzzle that hold a democracy together. On the one hand, ethical constitutional norms, the Constitution itself, and the most fundamental elements. Normally, when we have the loss of a democracy, it begins with an erosion and the destruction of voting. So if we take what happened under Trump and say we got to let's say there's 4 stages, we got to a stage 2, danger to our democracy. If it's pushed further and we do not have in the Republican Party those that align with the Constitution and the rule of law, then we can fall into really a bloody crisis in our country. I think we would recover, but that would be my nightmare scenario.
And House Republicans, of course, this morning just took another step towards that kind of dismal possibility. Elise Stefanik, now the House Conference Chair. There was a conservative challenger to her election this morning who complained she was too moderate for the job, and her record would seem to confirm that. But then I flash back to 2015 and 2016 when the Republican Party was saying the same thing about Donald Trump, who it appeared was willing to take almost any position that he thought would be advantageous, kind of like what Stefanik just did in her Trumpian evolution. In that sense, is she almost the perfect figurehead for where the party is right now?
I think she is the perfect figurehead of where the elected officials within the party are. I don't know, in fact, how unique she is. She's been raised to a leadership position, but we see that Liz Cheney is such a rarity. But I think what's so important here for the Republican Party to recognize is, and I think they would agree that their party is in an identity crisis. Well, what's the nature of that identity crisis? I think the most significant element in that identity crisis is the party's attachment, deep emotional attachment to Donald Trump and also to white Christian nationalism. So I think they're going to have to work very hard. They really have to break those attachments, or I do believe this party will continue to diminish, and I can't predict when it would go extinct, but it will. all the forces of progress are going towards a multiracial democracy where we prize equality. And the attachment to Trump is the number one thing that must be broken. And so that's why in this piece that I've most recently written, I try and generate a manifesto, less for myself than for future historians, who confirm to current Republicans that they're not only on a path that's destructive to our constitutional democracy, but that there is no doubt, Trump is really going to become the superstar in the Demagogue Hall of Fame, and their names are going to be dragged into that mud permanently with them. So there's more than one good reason for any Republican leader who's sitting on the fence. Let's say it's between, do I keep with Trump or do I follow Cheney into that painful pathway of profile and courage? I hope this piece would just do something small to help them make the right choice. What Republicans have to do is simple, and this is not the voters, it's the elected officials. They have to abandon Trump and find an independent force forward for themselves of conscience and of the highest valuation placed on our Constitution, the rule of law, and truth.
EliMerritt, Adjunct Assistant Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt University. Professor, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And up next on RFL, the CDC eases rules about masks for vaccinated Americans as the FDA approves vaccines for kids. But people still have a ton of questions about COVID and what they should still be doing to stop the spread. After the break, a top doctor from Johns Hopkins joins us with answers. Yesterday's big announcement from the CDC that vaccinated Americans can shed their masks in most situations is helping everyone get just that much closer to normal. But people still have lots of questions. As millions of vaccinated Americans begin a mostly maskless life, an air of excitement from coast to coast.
I'm ready to rip it off.
Thank God we're free.
The CDC releasing new guidance saying fully vaccinated people can ditch the face coverings and stop social distancing in most cases, with COVID-19 numbers going down across much of the country.
I see this as a brand new day. I'm excited to put away my mask, to go out and engage with friends and others like I used to.
But still a lot of questions and some hesitancy.
The question in my mind is when? What's the right time? And this feels premature.
There are exceptions. The CDC saying everyone should still wear masks in hospitals, on buses, trains, and planes, and if required by a state, county, tribe, employer, or business. Michigan, just a month ago, facing a surge in COVID cases, now lifting its mask mandate. But a number of states, like Massachusetts, keeping their policies in place.
There are some areas in this country that still have quite low vaccination rates, and so we can't treat it necessarily as uniform, and a lot of those decisions are going to have to happen at the jurisdictional level.
Target and Kroger still requiring face coverings. CVS says it's now reevaluating. More than 118 million Americans are now fully vaccinated, about a third of the U.S. population. A new CDC study says the mRNA COVID vaccines were shown to be 94% effective at preventing symptomatic COVID-19. But experts recommend unvaccinated people, including children, still wear masks indoors and in certain outdoor situations. And for even more answers, we turn to our next guest, Dr. Amish Adalja. He is a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security. He's also an emergency medical physician. Dr. Adalja, let's start with the obvious questions. On Wednesday, fully vaccinated people had to mask up anytime they were indoors and around other people. As of Thursday, they don't. What changed?
What changed is the CDC issued new guidance that really reflected the state-of-the-art data that we're seeing with the real-world impact of these vaccines as well as clinical trial data. Many of us had pushed the CDC to be bold and to be aggressive and to take that action earlier, but it's better late than never, and I think it really is a concretization of how these vaccines have the ability to change your life.
For the better part of a year, we've been hearing about herd immunity as the goal, but even with the vaccines, we're really nowhere near that point, and more experts are saying that we may never get there. That's got some people worrying that we might be moving too fast on this. How would you respond?
I'm not worried. And remember, herd immunity, although it is an important milestone, it's not necessary to cross that threshold in order to get control of the pandemic. Remember, the vaccines were designed to do three things: stop serious illness, hospitalizations, and death. And they've succeeded at that tremendously in the United States. Walk around in a hospital now in May of 2021, it's very different than what it was just in January of 2021. And that's because the vaccine went to those high-risk populations and basically tamed or defanged this virus. And if you look at countries that are highly vaccinated, like Israel, when they crossed around 40% of their population fully vaccinated, they sort of hit a tipping point where cases fell precipitously. And I think we're on that trajectory now in the United States with about 35% plus of our total population fully vaccinated. So while it's great to aim for herd immunity, we will get the benefits of the vaccine well below the herd immunity threshold.
As you mentioned, the percentage of people fully vaccinated in the U.S. is around 36%. That means about 64% of the country isn't vaccinated yet. And of course, there'll be no way to know if you're standing next to someone who's unmasked and unvaccinated. Now, I get that's going to be a bigger danger to the unvaccinated person than the vaccinated one, but is there still danger for the vaccinated person in that example?
No, if you are a fully vaccinated person, you really don't need to fear COVID-19. The virus is going to treat you very differently because you've been fully vaccinated, and that's why people can treat you differently. So you should not have any fear of other people that might not be unvaccinated if you're fully vaccinated.
So what should the mitigating factors be in the decision-making process for vaccinated Americans as they decide what to do in public and whether to wear masks or not?
I would tell them to go back to as much of their pre-pandemic habits as they can. There's going to be certain places where they still require masks because it's going to be hard to imagine, for example, a convenience store clerk to know who's vaccinated or who's not vaccinated. So they'll probably just say all customers need to wear their masks. And the same might be true on public transportation. But in all other settings, if the local regulations, if the private property owner allows you to remove your mask if you're fully vaccinated, I say go for it.
We have, of course, heard about some vaccinated people who then test positive. There are 8 players on the Yankees, the comic Bill Maher now among them. Of course, that's going to get people concerned. How do you respond to people who hear about those cases and start to either question the vaccines or the mask policy or both?
Well, first of all, you have to remember that when you hear about these reports of breakthrough infections, they get headlines because they are so extremely rare. So the CDC reports about 9,000 breakthrough infections, and that sounds like a large number until you know the denominator is around 100 million people fully vaccinated. So if you do the math on that, it's a decimal point with 4 zeros before you get a number. That is extremely low. So while breakthrough infections might occur, they are unlikely to be clinically significant. Most of them are not even people who have any symptoms. Most of them are not even associated with any level of virus that's contagious to others. So I don't think that following breakthrough infections in this situation, especially ones that have no symptoms at all, makes much sense. And it doesn't really change the value of the vaccines because they are so exceedingly rare that it's something that gets reported because it is so exceedingly rare.
The CDC has offered some specific examples of activities that are safe for vaccinated people. Obviously, it's not an exhaustive list. I keep wondering about big indoor events where people are going to be vocal. Arenas during basketball and hockey playoff games, concerts, Broadway shows, big churches, things like that. There's obviously a greater risk with the crowd cheering or singing. If you're vaccinated and masked in those environments or not masked, are there concerns in that kind of environment where you would think there would be an inclination for airborne transmission?
Not if you're a fully vaccinated person. I think in those situations, you are going to be safe. Remember, no vaccine is 100%, and the risk can never be zero. We can't put this virus back into bats. But I do think a fully vaccinated person in those types of situations really has little to fear. It's important to remember that we're not going to get to COVID zero. We've got to come up with a way to understand that there is this non-zero risk that's going to be with us now every time we step out the door. And being fully vaccinated gets that risk as low as it possibly can be without being zero. But I think people have to learn that this is now something that's out there, that we aren't going to get to a COVID zero world. And I think it's time for many people to get vaccinated and to get back to their lives.
Since we aren't going to know about people's vaccine status, do the new CDC mask rules push you one way or another on the value of vaccine passports or on companies, schools, and other entities requiring vaccinations?
I've always been in favor of having an easy way to verify vaccination status for businesses, because I think a business, if they're catering to vaccinated only people, or maybe they have a section that's only vaccinated only, they want to know that really quickly and easily. And I think there should be some innovation around apps and secure ways to verify someone's vaccination status, because a company or a business can go up to a higher capacity if they're dealing with vaccinated people. They can be more lax on social distancing rules if they're dealing with vaccinated people. So I do think that letting private industry be able to come up with innovative solutions to verify someone's vaccination status is going to be something that gets us quicker on the path to normalcy, and also rewards vaccinated people for being vaccinated and no longer being a threat to others.
Finally, Dr. Adalja, I want to ask about the single largest block of unvaccinated Americans, children under 12 who still aren't allowed to be vaccinated yet, though we heard from Dr. Fauci. He says that'll probably happen by the end of the year, if not earlier. Having them vaccinated would certainly make decisions easier for parents of younger kids about where they can safely go and what they can do without fear of putting their kids at risk. Of course, other parents are terrified of any sort of vaccine in their kids. How important do you think vaccinating kids is to our overall return to normalcy? And what would you say to frightened parents?
So what I would say is that vaccinating children is something that's a good thing to do, because although children are spared from the severe consequences of disease and they're not the major spreaders of infection the way they are with influenza, we've had children's lives disrupted because many parents, even though the risk is very low, have been very risk averse with their children. And children have been out of school for a long time. They've been unable to psychosocially develop as well as they would without this pandemic. So I do think getting them vaccinated makes it easier. And it's not necessarily because the child gets a lot of benefit from the vaccine itself, but it might give parents a peace of mind to kind of loosen the reins on children. It also will push teachers' unions and school boards to stop putting obstacles in the way of in-person schooling. So in that sense, I think that getting children vaccinated makes sense. Although strategically looking, those vaccines would probably be better used if they were going overseas to high-risk individuals in countries that are experiencing major surges. But that's not going to happen. So I do think that these are safe and effective vaccines in children. The side effect profile looks extremely good in those 12 to 15. The efficacy looks really good. We're going to get data on that 6-month to 11-year age group eventually. It's going to take some time, but I suspect that these vaccines will look good in that age group as well, and that age group will be eligible for vaccination. But I think, again, it's not necessary that those children be vaccinated in order for them to get back to their lives, because children are generally spared from severe consequences. But it's been the psychosocial impact on children, I think, that the vaccine really will help counter.
Dr. Adalja, really appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Up next, the job market recovering from the pandemic, but it's slow going. Republicans say that's because federal unemployment aid is too generous, leading would-be workers to stay home. After the break, we'll speak to an expert on the subject who says that's simply not true.
I know there's been a lot of discussion since Friday's report, that people are being paid to stay home rather than go to work. Well, we don't see much evidence of that. Anyone collecting unemployment who is offered a suitable job must take the job or lose their unemployment benefits.
That's President Biden's response to the latest Republican talking point that government benefits are so generous, would-be workers are staying home to collect them instead of taking jobs. That debate flared up after the monthly employment report came out last Friday, showing the economy added 266,000 jobs in April, a number that sounds good until you remember that the experts were anticipating 1 million new jobs. And now 2 million Americans are set to lose the enhanced federal jobless benefits they've been using to make ends meet. That's because Republican governors in more than a dozen states are moving to cut off those benefits. Our next guest says that's a mistake. Rebecca Dixon is the executive director of the National Employment Law Project. Rebecca, as you know, we're seeing Republican-led states roll back unemployment and other federal aid because they say that assistance is keeping people from going back to work. Even if that's true, I'm not convinced it's a bad thing necessarily. But before we get into that, I want to ask if it's true. Is that what the numbers and, more importantly, what unemployed workers are saying?
Sure. So cutting off these benefits is really short-sighted and cruel. And employers are driving a narrative that is false and simple about a complex issue. Rather than there being a deficiency in the work ethic of unemployed workers, the evidence really points to challenges around our care infrastructure and women actually not being able to return to the workforce because of care issues, as opposed to there being some issue with employees.
And if that federal aid is giving Americans greater license to be more selective about job possibilities, whether that's in quest of safer conditions or lower possible exposure to COVID, better pay and benefits, or whatever the case may be, is that a bad thing for workers or for the economy?
So an interesting thing to know about the UI system is that there is a requirement to search for suitable work. Now, that requirement was suspended in some states earlier in the pandemic, and states are starting to reinstitute it. But what that basically does is it says that to continue to get UI, workers have to actually be searching for work, but they have to search for suitable work, which means they can't be forced to take a job that pays substantially lower than what they were making before, and they can't be forced to go to a job that's unsafe.
So the battle lines are pretty clear in this debate. The workers and advocates say if you pay people more, keep them safe, give them benefits, give them a better environment, workers will return. Businesses and their advocates say that by the time that happens, so many businesses may be in so much trouble, there might not be enough jobs for the people who'll be looking. And both arguments make sense casually if you're listening. You're an advocate for workers. Why is the argument from employers incorrect?
The reasons that folks aren't returning to work are complex. And just because they have benefits, that's not necessarily the reason. We know that vaccination is uneven, that some jobs are more dangerous than others, and we know that these benefits are crucial to keeping families afloat right now who are struggling. We know that millions of families entered the new year owing $6,000 on average in back rent and utilities. And these benefits are crucial to keeping families in their homes and also to boosting the economy where they are in these states.
Do you think those businesses and the elected officials siding with them are being dishonest or disingenuous? Are you suggesting they're putting profits over the well-being of their workers?
I think they're just looking at one side of the story and looking at incomplete information.
A decade ago, I was reporting from Greenwich Village on the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Factory shirtwaist fire, which, of course, while tragic, helped spark the organized labor movement. And we know about its successes and then the later declines in labor unions in recent decades. In a lot of ways, it feels like this current moment is another flashpoint in the labor movement, except it's not organized. It's not being done by unions. Workers are just responding individually to their own concerns. Am I wrong to think of it that way? And how much more of a voice would workers have right now if we still had a vibrant, healthy union voice in these arguments?
You're absolutely right that workers have been leading the charge around these benefits and around lots of supports that they need during the pandemic. And they've been absolutely standing up and saying they will not put up with unsafe conditions during this pandemic. If we had unions, there would be a much more coordinated way for workers to join together and to put their voices together to change conditions. And so what we're seeing is a response to this moment and shift in our labor market where workers are actually reconsidering whether they want to work in low-paid jobs that have insecure hours where you don't know how many hours you're going to work from week to week, and they're actually looking for jobs in different industries that provide better benefits and better pay. And that's good for the economy.
You mentioned earlier in the interview, Rebecca, about the nation's care infrastructure, saying it's not back in place on the other side of the pandemic. What do you mean by that? What is the care infrastructure?
We know that a lot of child care centers closed at the outset of the pandemic, and they're not back up. And the other thing we know is that of April, at least a quarter of schools have not gone back to school in person. So we know that women are the ones who are doing the lion's share of the caregiving work, and they're the ones that we saw in the last jobs report that were not returning to the labor force. So we saw an uptick in jobs and returning to jobs in the industries where the employers are complaining. So leisure and hospitality actually saw a huge uptick in jobs in the last month, but those jobs went to men, and that's what points to the care infrastructure being something that's stopping women from getting back in.
I also keep thinking about health care. So many Americans over the past year have had to face both a public health crisis, which then has often become an individual medical crisis, without health insurance that's so often tethered to employment in the U.S. system. I keep wondering why we haven't had more of a robust debate this past year about decoupling health coverage from employment. I'm curious your thoughts.
I think that workers have so many things to contend with, and they've focused on the most basic ones like housing, food, utilities, and they haven't really had the opportunity to turn to healthcare because these other things are so pressing.
Is that a debate you think whose moment has come? Would this be the time for that debate?
I think it absolutely is the time. We're finding out that there is not a lot of rights that workers have around health and safety in the workplace. And we know that OSHA did not issue a standard that was enforceable. So workers still currently don't have a standard that's enforceable where they can enforce or have the right to have PPE or distancing on the job. So healthcare and health are really important to this. And worker health is public health. That's one thing this pandemic has made super clear to us.
And finally, Rebecca, for workers unemployed in those Republican-led states that are beginning to pare back those benefits, do you think that it's going to work? Do you think it is going to force people back to work, or have we faced a reckoning where even that might not incentivize workers enough?
I don't see it forcing people back to work. Actually, shutting off the benefits is not going to get our childcare infrastructure back up and running. That's actually not going to get schools reopened. So we're actually aiming our fire at the wrong thing.
Rebecca Dixon is the executive director of the National Employment Law Project. Rebecca, I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And up next on RFL, the pipeline is back online, but does that mean gas lines and higher prices are a thing of the past? After the break, the very latest on the cyber attack that disturbs supply for tens of millions of Americans. That massive oil and gas pipeline that was shut after a cyber attack is back up and running, but the gas shortages left in its wake are still a nagging problem for many along the East Coast.
With gasoline again flowing through this 5,500-mile pipeline stretching from Texas to New Jersey, pumps are slowly coming back online, and panic buying seems to be easing. But in areas where yellow out-of-service bags remain on pumps, patience is wearing thin a week after that cyber attack cut off the flow.
Makes you kind of realize how fragile we are as a society. Like this one little incident is all it took to kind of break down.
Colonial Pipeline promises in the coming days it will get better. Outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, rows of tanker trucks finally fueling up. That'll be delivered straight to gas stations, but it will take time.
I just called the gas company. They said it'll be 3 days before we get the delivery.
On Friday morning, close to 80% of gas stations in Washington, D.C. were dry. There are worries a shortage could impact the start of summer travel.
We're heading to Philadelphia, so we're like,
May have been a pretty bad time to do it, so we'll see. But right now we're lucky. We have like 300 miles, hopefully. And we got to find gas within that range.
ABC News confirming a report from Bloomberg that a ransom in the low millions was paid to the hacking group called DarkSide, believed to be based in Russia. The FBI has long urged companies not to pay such ransoms.
These are private sector entities, and they could be advised by the FBI not to do this because it encourages more hackers and it leads to more attacks on more people. But at the end of the day, they make their decisions based on the bottom line.
And now at the White House, the focus is on preventing future attacks. President Biden this week signed an executive order calling for the government and private businesses to come together to fight cyber attacks. But the immediate concern remains filling gas tanks.
All right, let's change the mood. After the break, we're going to lighten things up and take a look at the wide world of entertainment. Hollywood trying to kickstart its summer movie season. Broadway has set a date to reopen, and Americans are ready to return to normal, but will they return to the theaters? That's next. After more than a year of closures, movie theaters are reopening, and there's a full slate of summer blockbusters on tap. Plus, more than 20 Broadway shows have announced new performance dates as the Great White Way gets ready to restart this September. For more, we turn to an expert on all things New York and all things entertainment. Michael Musto is a journalist and commentator. Michael, I actually want to start off book with the return of the Village Voice and your return to it. As someone who grew up in the New York City suburbs and found what I can only describe as a previously unknown world within its pages, I could not be more pleased with its return and your return. Did you ever think you'd be able to go back home again?
No, but it does seem to be in my lifeblood. I can't seem to quit that place, and it's wonderful. It's always been my home base. My column, La Dolce Musto, started in 1984, lasted for about 29 years. They brought me back with a new owner after I was laid off. It just keeps coming back. It's now back as a quarterly print publication as well as an ongoing website. And I was in the first print publication of the New Village Voice, which premiered last month. And it's very Village Voicey. It really feels like the old days.
It is as New York as Times Square or a Nathan's hot dog. But we didn't book you to talk about The Voice. We wanted to talk about summer entertainment. Let's talk summer movies. As a fellow Broadway lover, In the Heights is the one that I'm most looking forward to. I'm curious what you're hearing about it and how faithful to the Broadway version it's going to be.
It's getting very good buzz, and it's pretty faithful, apparently. Of course, it's the Lin-Manuel Miranda musical that was a hit on Broadway, and it's about Dominican-American people in Washington Heights, Manhattan, way uptown, and it's about a bodega owner who inherits a fortune from his abuela, his grandmother. It's a spirited, upbeat musical. I hear it's faithful, but obviously opened up. It's a movie. It's not Broadway. Lots of dancing in the street. It's sort of like West Side Story, which is also coming back, but with nicer people, I think.
Nothing wrong about singing about New York, especially uptown in Manhattan. I want to ask you about A Quiet Place Part 2, which is also due this summer. The original was something of a surprise hit, but sequels are tricky. How much enthusiasm do you have for this one?
I think it's been enough time since the first one, because of the constant COVID lockdown postponements, that there is a built-in hunger to see this again. I don't want to see it in a theater because people will talk during it, and you don't want talking during A Quiet Place Part 2. But I will see it in a theater because that's the way they want it. And of course, John Krasinski, the director, and his wife in real life, Emily Blunt, they're back on screen, and it's about the Abbott family once again running from these creatures with very fine hearing.
Yeah, if only we could turn part of our politics into A Quiet Place Part 2. It would certainly make my life a lot easier. Other movies that are coming this summer include Black Widow and Cruella. I admit I am not in the loop on either of them. What do I need to know?
Black Widow, of course, is opening on July 9th. It's one of those Marvel movies. Scarlett Johansson reprises her role of Natasha Romanoff, the ex-KGB assassin, and it picks up where Captain America Civil War, where that left off, and Natasha is on the run, and it's Rachel Weisz is in it, as well as Florence Pugh, who was in Little Women. She was Academy Award nominated. So it seems like a pretty A-list Marvel film. It's a guaranteed box office smash. And then, of course, Cruella has Emma Stone as Cruella de Vil, who we originally saw in an animated film. Then it was live action with Glenn Close. Then it was a sequel. Now this is sort of like a prequel, where it's how did Cruella become so mean? How did this fashion designer develop a taste for the hides of Dalmatian dogs? And her antagonist is a baroness played by the other Emma Thompson. I think it looks pretty good. I mean, to me, Glenn Close is the ultimate Cruella, but Emma Stone is certainly capable.
I'm with you on the Marvel movies. Sometimes I feel like I need a flow chart to keep all of the characters and the stories in order, but they seem to be sticking pretty tightly to the universe they've built.
They pretty much control Hollywood, let's face it.
Yeah.
They recycle the same superheroes in different costumes, and it always makes a lot of money. I tend to avoid them, but I know there's a taste for them.
You touched on this, Michael, when you were talking about A Quiet Place Part 2, about where people are going to see these movies. How hard do you think Hollywood's going to be pushing for a return to theaters? And do you think the big hits of the summer will also be available to stream just as they were through the pandemic?
A lot of them will be available on streaming networks. There's a movie called Woman in the Window opening tomorrow on Netflix. Obviously, Netflix is still going to be very viable as a source, as well as other streaming services. But a lot of the studios really want you to go out into the movie theaters and see it. Get vaccinated again, and go to the theater. And I know one critic who requested a screening link of a big movie coming out, and they said, no, we want you to see it at a screening on a big screen. That's the bent now. Let's get back to semi-normal. And of course, all of these movies for the summer tend to be either sequels, prequels, familiar titles, things that the public wants to just kind of lose their mind at the door. So it is the kind of experience where you're going to want to get your popcorn, get your soda, sit with the public within the safe precautions and the new rules. But let's get back to movie theaters. I know I'm itching to go there.
Wanted to ask you about the Golden Globes. NBC just announced they're not going to broadcast next year because of serious problems with the Hollywood Foreign Press Association. Those problems, though, Michael, aren't exactly new. Why did NBC act now, and what's your reaction to NBC's decision not to air them?
I think it was a great decision. Somebody said, well, give the Golden Globes time. Well, the Golden Globes have been around for 77 years. The head of the Golden Globes, who just stepped down because he put a racist tweet about Black Lives Matter being a terrorist organization, which he then took down, he was a big problem. The fact that there's zero diversity in the organization and the voting is ridiculous. And this year, I thought, there had to be more shady stuff going on than usual, because usually they predict at least 2 or 3 out of the 4 acting Oscars. This year, they only predicted 1, supporting actor Daniel Kaluuya. So there was something a little fishy about the way they choose their winners. So whatever credibility they had built up from the year when Pia Zadora won Best Newcomer has been shattered. And I think it's a great time for NBC to say, get your stuff together, folks, get diversity, get credibility, and then maybe we'll take you back.
I did not expect a Pia Zadora reference to pop up during this interview, Michael. Thank you.
And speaking of our beloved Glenn Close, Pia Zadora beat Glenn Close for the award.
One of these days, Michael, you and I are going to run into each other at a Broadway theater. Broadway is coming back in September. I know you're a big fan. I am as well. Most of the big hits have announced their reopenings, but the theater needs at least 80% of seats to be filled and probably more to sustain. And I don't know if that's going to happen. How do you think Broadway responds, and do you see it rebounding to where it was before COVID?
Well, I noticed that Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo both said different things about when New York could reopen, but they were way before the fall. Broadway waited till the fall. They're waiting till September to start performances again. And I think that's a good time to start it again. And I think people are hungry to be back in a Broadway theater as well as a movie theater. And there are going to be approximately 30 shows opening by the end of the year. Some of them are reopening. Some of them are shows that were kind of in previews, or they were already opened and they had to pull the plug, and now they're back. They're getting back in shape. They're relearning their lines. I think a lot of them are going to do over 80% because people are going to start coming back to New York. It's the place to be. It's the place to reignite your excitement for life. It's the place for culture. And I don't think you're going to see a lot of empty seats for a lot of these shows. Yeah, even if Cats comes back.
Well, slow down. Let's hope Cats doesn't come back. Finally, Michael, this is definitely more your bailiwick than mine. New York City nightlife. If I've learned anything about nightlife in the city, and that is certainly questionable, it's that it's like money in politics. It will always find a way to get there. Or will it? Will nightlife in the city be back to where it was, you think?
I'm always bad at predicting, but I'm seriously predicting this time a return to the roaring 20s. People are itching for up in your face, up in your grill, social interaction again. And we have so many, sadly enough, empty spaces in Manhattan that I think people are going to take them over and turn them into dance clubs and lounges and all kinds of night spots. I already know of 2 gay clubs that are opening in Hell's Kitchen in the fall that weren't there before. So even though there's some detritus and some places had to shutter, there's going to be a renewed explosion of nightlife. And I'm excited because all the dance clubs and everything had moved to Brooklyn, which is fine. I'm from Brooklyn. It does count. But I live in Manhattan and I want stuff at my doorstep. And I think it's going to be real fun again. I think it's going to be a lot of dancing, drinking, in my case, diet soda. But there's going to be reason to celebrate again. And there are going to be places to celebrate at.
And hopefully that's the only itching that comes from New York City nightlife. I apologize. I couldn't resist. Well,
if Cats comes back, I am allergic. I am allergic.
Scratching and itching. Entertainment reporter and Village Voice Phoenix, Michael Musto. Michael, it's great talking to you. As always, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be back to wrap up RFL for the week right after this. That's going to do it for us tonight and for this week here on RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you back here Monday night at 6 p.m. Eastern. Have a great weekend.